human-caused climate change is one symptom among many of our overconsumption, of our inequity of resource distribution. We need to link all the topics, solve these fundamental problems that too few people own too much and consume too much in order to ensure that all of us are serving all of humanity. As I talked about hazards and about disasters which may involve or may be related to some of these weather phenomena, what we find is that poor weather does not have to lead to disaster. We find so many instances where there is intense, extensive rainfall, but no flood disaster. And other times when there is quite a bit of rainfall and we see a devastating cataclysm, which is a major catastrophe. So why this difference? And the difference is us. We have spent a lot of time trying to link conflict and also peace processes to changes in the environment. And what we find is that it is all by choices.
Climate change conversations often revolve around weather patterns, rising temperatures, and environmental impacts. However, there's a critical need to examine the human dimension of this global challenge, our choices, our systems, and our responses to environmental changes. In this episode, we speak with Professor Ilan Kelman, a distinguished scholar straddling multiple prestigious institutions, including University College London and University of Agder, Norway. His groundbreaking work in disaster studies, climate change, and health has challenged conventional narratives and offered fresh perspectives on how we understand and respond to environmental challenges. Professor Kelman brings a unique lens to the climate discourse through his extensive research. His work emphasizes how human decisions, rather than natural phenomena alone, shape the outcome of environmental events. As we navigate an era of unprecedented environmental challenges, Professor Kelman's insights on the interplay between human choices, climate change, and disasters offer valuable lessons for building a more resilient future. His perspective reminds us that while climate change poses significant challenges, our response to it remains fundamentally a matter of choice. Thank you so much, Ilan, for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here with us.
No, well, thank you, Anirudh, for the opportunity. I look forward to the discussion.
Ilan, can we begin this discussion by digging from the length and breadth of your experience and understand at the very outset that why climate change should be our concern?
Yes, we're all experiencing it. We know without doubt that human activity is changing the climate rapidly and substantively. We also know without doubt that we are not ready for the significant and intense impacts. So there's really two levels which makes it a concern. We first should not be changing the globe. We should not be changing the environment as much as we are doing in the way we're doing it. We are also locked into some of the impacts, so we need to ensure that we are ready for it. Nonetheless, not everything is linked to climate change, and there is so much that we can and should be doing, irrespective of us changing the climate. So it's always going to be that balance of recognizing human-caused climate change as a major concern, but it is definitely not the only major concern that we have to deal with. And there is so much that we ought to be doing, irrespective of our lack of actions on human-caused climate change.
Ilan, would you want to expand a little bit with respect to how this idea gets marred or gets confused with respect to what really climate change is and what is the entire nuance of human-caused climate change? Because I think the kind of work that you're doing tends to highlight that the entire problems that we are facing cannot be attributed to climate change, but it's also so much related to human-caused human actions as well. So if you want to take some time and highlight that.
Yeah, there's a couple of levels. One of them is that people often mix up or they conflate weather, climate, and climate change. So weather is simply the conditions which we see around us. Is it raining now? What is the air temperature? Then climate, by definition, is average weather, and we have to measure the weather typically over 30 years, 3 decades, which is sort of more than a generation. So climate itself is purely a statistical construct. In fact, think about sort of all the languages that we speak. And often there's not a one-to-one correspondence from the English words weather and climate to other languages. So it is intriguing that people suddenly say, well, everything's about climate. All climate is a statistical calculation. And that those statistics change. So of course average weather is changing. And this is again the other aspect that people get mixed up, that the climate has changed throughout the Earth's history, and it continues to do so naturally. One example is the Earth's orbit around the sun changes its shape, and the way the Earth is tilted with respect to its orbit also changes. That affects how much sunlight we receive, how much solar energy we receive, which changes the climate. We also know that the continents move. It's tectonic processes. It's called continental drift. These are very slow. Over eons, over epochs, mountains are formed, mountains erode. That affects the weather, which then changes the climate. And ecosystems too. When trees grow or when forests disappear, they create their own average weather conditions. They create their own climate. So climate change is natural, and it has led to ice ages, and it's taken us out of ice ages. We also need to be aware of volcanic eruptions and meteorite strikes. When they're big enough, they absolutely affect the globe's climate for years or even decades. Now, this does not stop us changing the climate. And what we are doing is actually changing the climate far more rapidly and far more substantively than we would expect any single species. So it's about recognizing these different approaches and the definitions. Weather is different from climate. Climate is different from climate change, because climate change is literally a change in the climate. It's a change in average weather. That change in the average weather absolutely happens naturally over many decades-long cycles and even longer. But we are definitely changing the climate. We need to be aware of that. We could stop now, and that would help reduce major impacts that we are going through at the moment, which we are not ready for and which are hurting us.
Ilan, as you say that, I think these are changes that have been happening over millennia. Plus, I think the use of fossil fuels have obviously exacerbated, and the other kind of land use changes that have been happening close to over 2 centuries that have accelerated its pace. As you are a professor of disaster studies as well, and that is something that has obviously been an increasing topic of discussion, considering we are looking at billions of dollars of losses because of disasters that are taking place. We are looking at a situation wherein 3.6 billion people in this world are living at risk, wherein they are prone to disasters. Would you want to highlight the correlation between climate change and disasters? And then again, you might want to expand a little bit as to how that can be mitigated by our actions.
So absolutely. So this is where it's helpful to tackle some of the myths and ensure that we are approaching it in a scientific manner. And you actually quite rightly highlighted that we are changing the climate by emitting greenhouse gases, but also through land use changes, which then absorb fewer of these greenhouse gases. And it's important to consider both these aspects. Interestingly, greenhouse gases do come from fossil fuels, but not only fossil fuels. So we have to recognize many sources, which include agriculture and which include substances which are not linked to fossil fuels, such as sulfur hexafluoride, such as nitrogen trifluoride, which leads to another aspect that people are so concerned about carbon dioxide, and quite rightly. And we talk about carbon offsets and carbon neutrality and zero carbon. Sulfur hexafluoride and nitrogen trifluoride are incredibly potent greenhouse gases. They do not have carbon. And many of the emissions from agriculture are actually from what's called NOx. So that's nitrogen and oxygen in different amounts. Again, it doesn't have carbon. Dealing with carbon and carbon dioxide is absolutely part of addressing human-caused climate change. It does not solve the whole problem. And absolutely, fossil fuels. We have enough to wean ourselves off fossil fuels. And we have to anyway because they are a finite resource. But it is not just about fossil fuels. It also includes the water uses of all these greenhouse gases. Nonetheless, we are changing the climate rapidly and substantively. There's no doubt. What are the implications? And these issues of disasters you raise appropriately. Yet, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, if we're not ready for them, then we do end up with absolutely horrific catastrophes. And there are definitely interplays between climate and tectonic processes, but a lot of them are simply not enough to particularly affect the earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or tsunamis that we experience. So there are many aspects to disasters which really don't have extensive links to climate change. But there are water, weather, climate-related hazards which are then involved in disasters, such as floods, droughts, many landslides, heat waves, cold waves, just tornadoes, blizzards, hail. Note that I was a bit careful in how I articulated this. I talked about hazards and about disasters which may involve or may be related to some of these weather phenomena. What we find is that poor weather does not have to lead to a disaster. We find so many instances where there is intense, extensive rainfall, but no flood disaster. And other times when there is quite a bit of rainfall and we see a devastating cataclysm, which is a major catastrophe. So why this difference? And the difference is us. If we wanted to, we know how to construct infrastructure that isn't going to collapse during a tornado. And yet in December 2021 in Kentucky, over 70 people were killed in a tornado swarm, even though they had hours of warning. So what went wrong there? Many places recognize that droughts recur. They plan for it, they deal with it, they lack water, and a drought happens and it's not a big issue. In other places, people die from lack of water and from dehydration. So why the difference? And the difference is very much us. Some people can deal with temperature extremes and extensive rainfall and storms, others cannot. And what it comes down to is simply the options, the political power, the resources that we are offering to them. So it could be that people are forced to live in a floodplain and they have to go to work, so they cannot evacuate when there's a flood warning. They cannot afford flood resistance measures. They may not even have the time to look for, set up, and follow evacuation routes. It could be that a government put money to the military, not building a bridge across a river, so when the river is high, kids cannot get to school. They lose out on their education. It could be that they have mobility restrictions, and society has not been set up to help them evacuate with their mobility restrictions or evacuate with the people for whom they care. And then in many places, we see people actually calling out corruption. They say, the town council built these houses in a dangerous area without taking measures, and they may be arrested or harassed or incarcerated or even killed because they challenge those in authority. None of this has to do with climate change. None of this has to do with us changing the climate. It's not even linked to the weather. It's the fact that when the environment does what it typically does, it rains or it snows, there's hot spells, there's cold spells, tornadoes happen, storms happen, cyclones happen. The environment does what it does. We have set up society to make that become a disaster. We have created the disaster. And because we create that disaster, the disaster is not coming from nature, so it is not a natural disaster. Even when there is a disaster involving a cyclone or a hurricane or a drought or a flood, we avoid the term natural disaster because the disaster comes from us. So what does all this have to do with human-caused climate? And the answer is, if we can deal with a flood or a drought or a storm or a temperature extreme or a landslide, it does not matter how they are changing or how we are changing them. We should be able to deal with it. But those who are poor, those who are oppressed, those who are marginalized, cannot deal with these perfectly typical environmental events or their changes. So yes, disasters happen. The disaster is still coming from us, not from us changing the climate, with exceptions. And this is where we are actually changing the climate so much that we are producing hazards that we simply cannot survive. The one which is killing us today is heat waves, heat humidity. We are right now in heat temperature extremes, including humidity, which modern humanity has simply never gone before, and it is unsurvivable, particularly for people who work outdoors, such as agricultural workers, construction workers, delivery workers. They basically have a choice to lose their job or to risk losing their life because of the heat humidity. And that has knock-on effects for our food supply, for our supply chains, for our buildings, for our deliveries. So this is where it gets terrifying. And even though heat humidity is an exception to the rule that human-caused climate change does not cause disasters, this exception is so scary, and we are seeing it now, that it alone is a reason to stop us changing the climate. But heat humidity is not the only one. There's actually a whole series of changes that we are inducing which we've never before experienced and which we're not ready to deal with, and they will be catastrophic due to how much they are changing. They are in the future, coming years, coming decades, even a few potentially over centuries. Right now, we can directly attribute a certain proportion of heat wave deaths to human-caused climate change. That cannot get better. That is going to get worse. It impacts children's education. It impacts our healthcare systems. It impacts people being able to get to work and then to socialize and have networks. And heat humidity is a terrifying disaster, which we are making so much worse by changing the climate.
So, Ilan, if I were to summarize what you've just said and distill it, it's like a push and pull between the natural forces and what humans have done. And that too, how humans have exacerbated some of the results that all of these disasters are being caused. Secondly, we could also mitigate a lot of these effects by smarter planning, by consciously realizing that we don't tend to meddle with the natural phenomenon. I realized from a past conversation when you told me that when a flood occurs, it's the area from which the water follows. If we have created homes and lands in those floodplains, the water will take its course and will cross that. So it's not a disaster as such. We are going into that area and we are inviting it onto ourselves. So I think the interpretation is very profound when it comes to the push and pull between these two factors. And to take it forward from there, I think, as you were mentioning about some of these disasters, I think some of the other profound thing that we're looking at is conflict. We are living in an age wherein there are certain estimates that 1 billion people are living at the threat of being displaced by 2050 because of all of these conflicts. Climate is being referred as a threat multiplier. And with all the geopolitical tensions that we see today in today's world, that's certainly going to act as a multiplier. Would you want to touch a little bit on that? How does there's a correlation between that, and what can what are some of the indicators on which we must focus on today?
That was a brilliant summary, and particularly your second point that we can and should act to deal with nature means that it doesn't become a push and pull. When we set it up that way, we're actually setting up a confrontation or conflict with nature rather than living with nature. So stop pushing, stop pulling, just live with nature and reduce disasters, which is the same with conflict. In the same way that the people with power and resources make choices to create disasters, conflicts and peace are choices by human beings, by those leaders. We have spent a lot of time trying to link conflict and also peace processes to changes in the environment. And what we find is that it is all by choices. So even if we consider disasters, part of this I wrote in a book which is called Disaster by Choice, to express how it's not that people are at fault for living in dangerous areas. They are often forced to live in dangerous areas. So you can look that up, just my name in Disaster by Choice, in the same way that very few people choose to be in a war. It is our leaders who are choosing to be in a war. And they may use a disaster or climate change or other environmental phenomena as an excuse. They are still making that decision. And it's basic common sense, right? Let's say I'm leading a country. I do not wake up in the morning and say, oh, the temperature today is 35 degrees Celsius. Yesterday it was 33 degrees. So you know what? Today I'm going to start a war. Of course that doesn't happen. Wars are political. Leaders are political. And they may express reasons for why they have to kill others. They are still making that choice. It's the same with peace. When we look at it, if someone in power wants peace, they find a reason to reach a peace deal, which involves cooperation, it involves compromise, it involves give and take. And if they are willing to do that, then we end the conflict. We've particularly dived deeply into this through disaster diplomacy work. So anyone can go to disasterdiplomacy.org, that's one word, disasterdiplomacy.org, and see how we've tried so hard to find examples where a disaster or dealing with a disaster or environmental change or dealing with environmental change has actually caused long-term conflict or long-term peace. Every single example had another reason, not linked to the disaster, not linked to environmental change, not linked to trying to deal with the disaster, even when those in power may have used the excuse of disaster-related activities or may have used the excuse of climate change or other environmental changes to explain the reasoning of why they're pursuing certain war or peace pathways. So it's about us. And it's really those who have the minority, who have the power, who have the opportunities, who have the resources, who tend to make choices for the huge majority, which don't have any of that. And that means creating disaster. That means creating war and conflict when many of us end up dying without much option. But what we hope is then this will lead to them making the choices to seek peace and to avoid disasters. And we have so many examples of it. So of course conflicts have ended when people sat down and wanted to end the conflict. Even avoiding disasters, because we can sometimes move out of a floodplain, because we can build infrastructure which withstands a tornado and an earthquake, we are compiling examples of disasters avoided. And it's one word, disastersavoided.com. You can just go to disastersavoided.com and see these examples. There are the exceptions which I mentioned, like heat, humidity, but in general, no matter how we are changing the climate, there are so many disasters we can and should avoid. There are conflicts we can and should avoid, and we need to recognize those who are the causation rather than trying to shift that blame and put it onto climate change or environmental change or the earthquake. because we can and should do so much to help each other, those with power often make other choices.
I think to me it comes across more as another sort of greenwashing where it could be a better idea to maybe relatively shift the blame on something else, because I think this narrative does bring home a message that at times it's our choices that are leading us to the places where we are at and not any other external circumstances which could obviously be measured and taken care of.
And you're
And
absolutely right on that. And so we have to be careful how we articulate it. When people refer to climate change as a threat multiplier, it can also be a threat reducer if we make that choice. Or we can just say we want to reduce threats irrespective of climate change. So apart from the really awful exceptions, apart from the fact that we should not be changing the climate, we can often make the threat us rather than referring to climate change as being the threat influencer.
considering your line of argument, Ilan, I'm also interested to see that how would you relate it with migration? Because we are living in a world wherein the weather is changing and people, maybe because of you, we can attribute it that we were wrong in the first place to maybe settle in a floodplain, but the idea is that people are being forced to evacuate. There are patterns that are changing. I'm living in an area where it's supposed to be nice and breezy out here, where I'm here in Chandigarh, but it's the hottest time which we have ever experienced in our lives before. And obviously, we are privileged, but there's a huge section that is being forced to move out of certain areas because it's just uninhabitable. So there's so much migration that's related, which sort of we could say that the things are not the same anymore. So maybe people are being forced to move out. There's migration. I'm more interested to see how would you frame that argument and how much can we attribute it to climate change, how much it can we attribute to human choices, and how can we mitigate it?
Yeah, migration is definitely an interesting one, so thank you for raising it. Again, people conflate climate and climate change, and they conflate migration and forced migration. Do people move because of the climate and because the climate is changing? Yes. We've always done so. At the end of the last ice age, people moved because the climate was changing, so it was opening up vistas, and that's how humanity settled the world. Even today, people will purchase places to retire in warmer locations. So, for example, people in Ontario often buy condominiums in Florida. They may move there permanently, or they may just move for the winter. People in the UK will purchase a second home or retirement home along the French or Spanish Riviera on the Mediterranean. They are migrating because of climate change. Sorry, they are migrating because of climate, because they want that climate change from the northern latitudes to the lower latitudes. We don't call them climate migrants. Ontario to Florida, they're called snowbirds. In the UK to the Mediterranean, they're called expats or expatriates. Because when choices are made, apparently that's good migration, but when people are coming to other places, sort of they are coming to us, that apparently is bad migration. But yes, people from the Mediterranean may feel it's too hot for them, or they like the climate in the UK, so they will move for the climate. Same with people in Florida moving to Ontario. Those are choices. And when people make those migration choices, it's often for education or jobs or family or adventure or excitement. Sometimes it is for climate. So yeah, climate migration happens. People are seeking a change in the climate. Or it may be that a certain location does have a local or regional climate change. The debate today is actually more about human-caused climate change leading to forced migration. This is where we've spent years trying to find examples, and there are always other influences than climate change. There are always other factors. Absolutely, after a huge flood or a huge drought or a huge earthquake, if people were not ready for it, so a disaster happened, people feel forced to migrate. Absolutely, we see the horrific situation of millions being forced to flee from everything they know because of war, because of conflict, because of violence. As we discussed earlier, linking disasters and violences to human-caused climate change is tenuous and not easy to do. Even low-lying islands, atolls, people will say, well, what about Maldives? What about Tuvalu? Well, at the moment, we cannot find climate change-related forced migration. Tuvaluans and Maldivians migrate. They've always migrated. They frequently want to migrate. We cannot find links at the moment to human-caused climate change. That could alter in the future. And particularly sea level rise is going to accelerate in coming decades. That could change the situation, or it might not. We don't fully understand it. We'll have to see. What is particularly intriguing within all this is the phrase climate refugees or climate change refugees. And refugee actually has a specific legal meaning, which is under international law, and people cannot be given refugee status due to environmental change, including climate and climate change. So we actually know the exact number of climate refugees and climate change refugees. That number is 0. And that number will continue to be 0 unless the legal definition of refugee changes. So it's really about giving people the opportunities so that they do not feel forced to migrate. It's really about giving people the power and the resources so that they do not feel forced to migrate. And one way, well, stop war. Easy to say, not hard to do, because war, unfortunately, has also been a human condition. The one exception, it comes back to exactly what you said, is heat humidity. There's absolutely no doubt that we are in regimes of heat waves that humanity has not experienced, and far, far too many people right now are facing the choice of leave their home, leave their livelihood, or risk dying in the heat. That is forced migration. That is forced migration linked to climate change, human-caused climate change, and we can absolutely ascribe them as being forced human-caused climate change migrants. Heat, humidity.
Ilan, with all the context that we have about the kind of situations that we are facing and the hazards that are out there and the challenges that we all face together, if we were to summarize all of this conversation, and if I were to put a question to you with respect to a call to action question wherein maybe what's your way forward, which if given a choice, how would you chart the way out of the situation in which we are in? Maybe I would love to hear some of the aspects with which maybe we could mitigate human caused climate change on different aspects that you talked about the ways in which we can increase our resilience. And maybe, I know we're running out of time, but if you could add a dash of some of the aspects of eco hope and eco inspiration, the work that you have done, a dash of that would also be great.
The eco-hope and eco-inspiration, the climate hope and climate inspiration comes from exactly what you're saying, that action plan. We know what to do, we just have to do it. Well, again, easy to say, but so what? Well, we know what to do, we have the resources. We have the money. We have the knowledge, we have the technical skills, we have the technology, we have the engineering. We need to change our behavior, particularly the behavior of the minority causing the problems, in order to help all of humanity. It's basically about equitable distribution of the resources. Why are we spending about $2 trillion a year on declared defense, basically weapons to kill people? Why is there about 1 trillion euros a year that goes to corruption and illicit financial flows around the world? Why are banks in the UK not tackling those and stopping it so that money stays in the so-called poor countries? Most to the point is the fact that our governments spend over 400 billion euros a year on fossil fuel subsidies directly, and more than 10 times that amount subsidizing fossil fuel companies indirectly. If we stopped killing each other, if we stopped subsidizing these huge companies, if we were honest with ourselves, we would be overflowing with the money that we need to wean ourselves off fossil fuels, to improve our land use changes, to implement, monitor, and evaluate and enforce building codes and planning regulations to ensure everyone is in school, to ensure everyone has health care. That's all we need to do. That's our action plan. Within this, of course, is the issue of what leads to these problems, particularly human-caused climate change, and fundamentally is about our consumption rates. So a lot of us, particularly the elite minority, do need to reduce the amount that we consume. Part of it is also recognizing the need for ethical population stabilization. So this is not a Malthusian approach saying, oh, it's just about people, it's just about numbers of people. It's saying that there's a finite amount of resources on this planet. We all must have some level of consumption to have quality of life, quality of lifestyles, and we need to ensure that we are consuming sustainably, which then leads to absolutely reducing the level of consumption of the elite, but ensuring that those who are struggling to make ends meet every day, those who are struggling to put enough food on the table every day, that those can come up to a level of consumption which does not destroy the planet. And that means having a stable population, but doing so ethically. So my one baseline is consider but do not focus on human-caused climate change. Human-caused climate change is one symptom among many of our overconsumption, of our inequity of resource distribution. We need to link all the topics, solve these fundamental problems that too few people own too much and consume too much in order to ensure that all of us are serving all of humanity, having wonderful lives and lifestyles and quality of life without consuming all of the resources available, but ensuring that it works for future generations over coming centuries and coming millennia. We know what to do. We've everything that we know to do it. That's where the hope and the inspiration come from. The real challenge, and this is where it is scary, how do we actually achieve it? And that's where we need everyone to be on board, to work together in order to ensure that we reach the goal that we know we owe ourselves.
I think how you've summed it up, I think you've already given the answer. When you say that, how do we achieve it? I think through your talk, it's quite visible the central argument comes around to choice. It's as easy as making the right choice I think, is the antidote to all of the problems that we discussed today. So,
Anirudh, that was such a wonderful summary. Thank you so much for distilling it.
yeah. Thank you so much, Ilan, for your time. I am so glad that we could zoom out of the technical points that somehow happen to take a lot of center stage, but also focus on a lot of other parameters that we need to work together so that yes, we need to come out, but we need to come out together with everyone, and that too stronger and better. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity. It should not stop here. We will continue being in touch, and anyone can find me online. Please get in touch to teach me and to support each other.
I'll share all the links to your websites, to the links that you mentioned in the description so that everyone can access it. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks to you for all the work you're doing.